Bothers me. Clicker down.
To move forward. Okay.
Let me just introduce you real quick.
Sure.
All right, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much. We've had a great morning with Logan. You're going to have all day with Logan tomorrow. Why are you? You're packing that up like a horde. It's going to all day. I'm not even in the shop tomorrow. This will be great. And you won't know the difference. Okay. So our next speaker, I'm really happy to have with us join us today. He is a professor in the Department of History at the Center University of New York. Benjamin Hett was born in Rochester, but grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada, leaving him with a lifelong, mostly heartbreaking attachment to the Edmonton Oilers of the NHL. I did that. He earned a BA in political science from English literature from the University of Alberta, and then a JD from the University of Toronto. 4 years of legal practice. And instead, it felt like 8, convinced him to return to the University of Toronto for an MA in history before he moved on to Harvard for a PhD. Sasha, okay. For 2 years, he taught history and literature program at Harvard alongside advising graduate students at the Harvard Law School. In 2003, he joined the faculty of Hunter College in 2006, and that of the Graduate Center of CUNY. Hett's work has dealt with a number of themes, from the theory and practice of criminal law in Germany, through the coming power of the Nazis and the legacy of National Socialism in post-war Germany, to the work of the West German intelligence services in the 1950s. He is the author of 6 books. You will only get one of them. Okay, and a number of articles. Hett's been the recipient of the Annelies, is it Tim?
Anneliese Timme.
And the Hans Rosenberg Prizes for the best article and best book, respectively, on German history by a North American scholar. We are really excited and happy to have Dr. Hett joining us today. This will be very different from Logan's presentation because this is one to edify you in particular. So I hope that you will give him your undivided attention and you'll ask questions and will engage like you've been so thoroughly doing today, and we really appreciate and welcome our esteemed scholar, Dr. Benjamin Hett. Thank you, Dr. Hett.
Well, thank you. Can you all hear me okay? All right. Well, I'm super happy and honored to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation to come. It's going to be a bit of a different thing, obviously, than this morning, but I came for the morning session, which I really enjoyed, and I feel like I learned a lot. There's definitely things that came up this morning that I'm going to take away and think about in my own classes. So it's a tough act you give me to follow, Logan. I'll see what I can do here. But so my plan here is I want to talk a little bit about one of my sort of odd professional specialties, which is the process by which the Nazis came to power in Germany in the 1930s. So I'll talk a little bit in terms of content, and then we'll open it up, and I hope you'll have questions, and I hope we'll have a sort of looser discussion. But even while I'm talking about some of the content things, please, if you have questions, feel free to ask, or comments, feel free to raise them. This is obviously, most of what I'm going to talk about here is kind of prequel to the sort of main things you're talking about this week, or that you will be concerned with teaching if you're teaching about the Holocaust. But probably equally obviously, the Holocaust happening was dependent upon the Nazis coming to power in Germany. It's pretty hard to imagine the Holocaust happening in anything like the form that it did happen if you did not have that regime in power in Germany. So this is an important part of the context, and we were talking a little bit this morning about, contextualizing the historical things. What Germany was in the 20s and in the early 30s is, I think, a really important part of that context. Just by way of introduction to these pictures here, in a way, I think these two pictures tell a story. of what happens to Germany between the 20s and the 30s. If you are, as I am, a fan of the TV show Babylon Berlin, you may recognize the top left picture. That's a still from that show. If you're not familiar with it, it's a show based on a series of detective stories by a writer named Philipp Kutscher, which feature a police officer in Weimar, Germany. At least that's where it starts, and the series proceeds into him being a police officer in Nazi Germany. The show so far has been on the sort of pre-Nazi part, and it depicts Berlin as I think a lot of people are familiar with Berlin in the 20s, or at least the idea of it, a city of incredible artistic and cultural creativity, and also a fair bit of decadence, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two, but a city of a lot of experimentation in every form, including sexual experimentation, lifestyle experimentation, artistic, scientific, and political experimentation. And somehow out of that extremely dynamic and creative scene of Germany in general and Berlin in particular in the 1920s, somehow we get to the Nazi regime. And here, in a sort of a way, this is one of my favorite pictures from the Nazi regime. Favorite needs to be in quotes, but you know, these fresh-faced, you know, teenage girls, I imagine not different at all from students that most of you would be working with, but enthusiastically waving their Nazi flags, and they are in fact greeting Adolf Hitler. That's the part you can't see in the picture, but he's about to come and speak to them. And so they are very, very happy to see Adolf Hitler. And that, I think, gives the picture a lot of its power and makes it really chilling. And somehow you get from this to this, right? I think that's a kind of shorthand for what is, I think, some of the fascination of this story in general, or at least for me. And I'm a total nerd for this particular story, the story of how Germany got to this regime. I've ended up writing 3 books about it. I started off writing a biography of a guy named Hans Litten, who might be the historical figure I most admire, an extraordinary young trial lawyer who devoted his practice in Berlin in the late 20s and early 30s to trying to stop the Nazis, trying to use the criminal law in particular to stop the Nazis. At the sort of high point of his career, he summoned Hitler to be a witness in a trial. This was in 1931, before Hitler was in power. And Litten subjected Hitler to a grueling, roughly 3-hour cross-examination in which he basically tore Hitler to shreds and humiliated him. And you can imagine how excited Hitler was about this young man after that. So 2 years later, a little less than 2 years later, Hitler came to power. And Hans Litten was one of the first people to be arrested, and then he was subjected to years of brutal treatment in concentration camps, torture and hard labor and various other things like that, eventually dying in Dachau, the concentration camp just outside of Munich, early in 1938. He took his own life, but he took his own life because it was clear to him that he was never going to get out and he was going to die in a concentration camp. And Litten was arrested the night of the Reichstag fire, one of the sort of famous early events of Nazi Germany, exactly 4 weeks into Hitler's time in power, and with an election campaign in progress, the Reichstag, the parliament building, suddenly caught fire. And there is a controversy to this day about who set it. I actually call it, it's sort of the German history version of the Kennedy assassination. Like basically, was there one crazy guy who did it by himself, or was the crazy guy there as part of someone else's conspiracy? And this debate still goes on. I got intrigued by that debate partly because since Litten got arrested that night, I spent a lot of time researching the kind of police paper trail on how he got arrested, which kind of led me into this controversy. And I ended up writing a book about it, which my book is itself somewhat controversial, I have to say. But it also dealt with that same process. It dealt with those years in which the Nazis were rising to power and democracy was going down the drain. And then I thought I was sort of done with this subject. And then I was asked to write another book, which is the one, lucky you, that you're going to be getting, which sort of tells the story in a sort of overarching way of the process by which the Nazis came to power, dealing really with the late 20s and the early 30s in Germany, and sort of explaining, at least as I see it, how it was that this particular party could triumph politically in this particular setting. And some of the fascination of this, at least for me, is a fascination which I think a lot of people have felt with this story, which is how can we get our minds around this? Germany in the 1920s, by any standard, was a remarkably sophisticated, culturally advanced, in many ways highly innovative country whose physicists and chemists, whose artists and architects, whose musicians were leading the world and innovating in ways that wasn't always happening elsewhere. It was also a place of, in many ways, remarkable political and social progress with a highly democratic political constitution, a highly democratic political system, with social campaigns for rights that were leading the world, the biggest gay rights movement in the world in the 1920s, campaigns to legalize abortion and other things like this. So in many ways, very cutting edge. And out of this very, very liberal and very cutting edge place, in just a few years, you slip into this incredible abyss of barbarism, which still sort of sets standards for what barbarism means. And how do we get our minds around that? I mean, on some level, I don't know. If any of you know, please let me know. In some ways, I don't get it, but it's out of the fact that I don't get it that I continue to be fascinated by the story of how this could happen, how this country could move into this political direction. So I have some thoughts on this, which is what I'm going to talk about today. I should preface this by saying almost everything I'm going to say today is highly debatable. A lot of the smartest people ever have been writing about this story for almost a century now. And there's very little agreement among all those really smart people who have dealt with this subject. There are people who say, well, the problem with Germany in the 20s, it was too democratic. And then there are scholars who say, well, the problem with Germany in the 20s is it wasn't democratic enough. And that's why you get the Nazis. Well, both of those can't be right. But there are smart scholars out there who hold those views. Or just to take another example, there's long been a view that one of the problems with the Nazis is that they were really, really sexually repressive and repressed. And out of sexual repression, you get this kind of authoritarian, whatever you want to call it, fascism, whatever. But then there are scholars who say, no, actually, the Nazis were what we would call today very sex positive. They weren't repressed at all. And that's the problem. So, again, both of these things can't be right. But again, this debate sort of goes on. And so, everything I'm going to say basically from now on is kind of my take, but please be aware that there are many other views. And if anyone's interested in information on what the other views might be, I'm more than happy to give you some reading selections. Well, I can work this. So this is a breakthrough right there. Okay. I'm older than any of you probably. And so when the tech's happening for me, I feel good. Okay, so I want to start with a few basics. I don't know how many of you may have, in somewhere in your lives and study gotten into the weeds of how the Weimar Republic worked, but I suspect not all of you. So let's do a quick tour of the weeds of what the Weimar Republic was and how it worked, because that's the context out of which Nazi Germany comes. So first, super basic. We talked about using, explaining terms in the morning session. The Weimar Republic is the name we give to the political regime in Germany that existed, roughly speaking, between 1918 and 1933. If you want to get really cute, you can quibble with that time, those dates, but that's basically it. The official name of the country, by the way, not everybody knows this, fun fact, the official name of Germany was the same all the way from 1871 to 1945. Despite regime changes, the country actually never changed its official name. It was always the German Reich, das Deutsche Reich, the German Empire. And that was true in the Weimar Republic. It was true in Nazi Germany. But we don't actually sort of operate that way in terms of thinking about the historical evolution. So we refer to Germany in that era as being the Weimar Republic, and that describes this democratic system which arose just as Germany was being defeated in World War I and then set the political tone until Hitler came in 1933. So the first thing here is the Weimar Republic recreated the German constitution. They drafted a new constitution for a democratic system, and it was highly, highly democratic. It is sometimes referred to in the literature as a professor's dream. And weirdly, that's not meant as a compliment. I don't understand that, but apparently something that professors come up with is actually not good. And I understand what they mean, because the Weimar Constitution was actually sort of too good for human beings, actually. It would have worked fine if people were a little better than they were. But one thing I learned in law school in my earlier, disrespectable youth as a lawyer, is that the great Supreme Court Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. once said, you have to draft laws with the bad man in mind, not the good man, because laws are there to stop the bad man, not the good man. And this is the mistake that the drafters of this Constitution made. They did not draft a Constitution thinking of the bad man. They thought of the good man, so to speak. Bad person, good person. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. So first of all, the Constitution called for elections on a proportional system. This is the way elections generally work in European countries to this day. It's very different from how they work in the United States or countries with a sort of British-derived parliamentary system like Britain or Canada. So what that meant was in an election for the national parliament, you didn't vote for a candidate. It's not like a congressional election here where you're voting for somebody in your district. They didn't have districts and they didn't have local candidates. What you would vote for was a party. You would simply cast your vote for one of the political parties. And then what the political parties would do is they would have a rank order list of people. And then the votes get counted up, and whatever the vote share was going to a particular party, that's the share of elected members of the parliament they would get. So you would just go down your list, and however far down your list you get to your vote percentage, those are the people who become your parliamentary deputies. So for instance, if, as happened in one election, if the Nazis get 18.1% of the vote, that's what they got in 1930, they get 18.1% of the members of the parliament, just straight flow through. Now, this is kind of democratically perfect because that means that the national parliament has exactly the composition of how people voted. But it has many drawbacks, not least of which is proportional systems tend to give you parliaments with many parties. Because our system, which is called the first past the post system, where sort of one person wins a district if they have the most votes, and then that's it. That sort of forces parties to aggregate, because to win, you need to sort of aggregate. In a proportional system, you don't need to aggregate. So you can have kind of fringy parties that will still win seats and can have an impact on the national politics. And so you tend to get a lot of parties, and that was the case in Germany, where there tended to be, if you count them all up, somewhere between 30 or 40 parties in every elected parliament. And then many of them are fringe. And so one of the drawbacks is this gives a sort of fringy party a way to get a national voice, and you may not want that. And in fact, in the case of the Nazis, you really didn't. But the Nazis were one of those fringy parties for a long time. We'll get to this in a second. There was a bigger flaw in the Constitution, though, and this is really where you get to drafting a Constitution for good people and not bad people. And that is Article 48, which is by far the most kind of infamous and well-known clause in this Constitution. And Article 48 was the emergency powers section. What it basically said is that the president of the republic, who was directly elected but separately from the national parliament with a different term of office of 7 years instead of 4 years for the parliament. So the president could do basically anything he wanted using a decree under the emergency powers, basically equivalent to an executive order of an American president. So the president could do basically anything under one of these decrees, including overriding the whole Constitution, if he could get one other minister to co-sign with him. So the chancellor, who is the actual head of the cabinet, or any of the cabinet ministers, if they signed along with the president an emergency decree, then it comes into force and it could completely override anything in the Constitution. So you could do basically anything at all. All you have to do is say as the president, oh, there's an emergency, I need to do X. And you get one other person to sign, and then it's good. Now, there was a check and balance, so to speak, here, and that is that the elected parliament, the Reichstag, could vote to overturn anything the president did by an emergency decree. And it was assumed by the drafters of the Constitution that anyone who got elected to be president of this new republic would by definition have to be someone who believed in democracy, because why would someone who didn't believe in democracy be running to be president of a republic? That was the assumption. The assumption, spoiler alert, turned out to be wrong. But it was also assumed that in giving that check and balance, well, the parliament could check a president who was sort of becoming a runaway, so that should be fine too. And in fact, what this did is set up the real drama of German politics in the early 30s, which is something else I'll get to in a sec. What else? All right. One of the things that tends to drive historians of Germany like me crazy is when people say, "Oh, Germany was a totally authoritarian state until 1918, and then overnight it became a democracy." And new democracies always have trouble. So that's why there was so much trouble in German democracy, because they're new at it and Germans didn't understand it. Well, that's completely wrong, or pretty close to completely wrong. By the time the Weimar Republic was created, every part of Germany had at least decades of experience with parliamentary politics, with modern mass political mobilization, with political parties, with campaigns to get political parties elected. All of that had been happening on a national level in Germany since 1871, and when Germany was created as a unified state. And many of the separate regions of Germany had traditions of parliamentary electoral politics going back further, going back as far as a century in some parts of the country. So in other words, in the early 19th century, you have some parts of Germany having kind of more or less democratic parliamentary electoral politics. So Germans had tons of experience with elections, with political parties, with mobilization, with sort of free electoral campaigns. All of the main political parties of the Weimar Republic all had either existed before World War I, or at least were sort of renamed versions of parties that had existed before World War I. So there's a long continuity of these political parties. So the Germans were very experienced, actually, with democratic political mobilization. That wasn't the problem. There were other problems with the Weimar Republic. Periodization. Typically, historians of the Weimar Republic talk about, even though it's 14 or 15 short years, we talk about there being three quite distinct phases that this republic went through before it collapsed. The early phase from 1918 through 1923 was a period of basically chaos and upheaval. First of all, a revolution that was resulted in the regime change, which created the new democracy in 1918 and 1919. But then that was followed by basically 5 years of civil war, as there were political extremes on both ends of the spectrum who were unhappy with the new democratic state and tried to overthrow it. The extremes from the right, but also extremes from the left. Germany had a new communist party in 1919, which sought to emulate the Soviet Union. And for the communists, the moderate democracy set up mainly by the Social Democratic Party, which was the main center-left party, was too conservative. Not enough like the Soviet Union. So they tried to overthrow it. They tried several coups. The far right tried several coups. The result was basically civil war and chaos. This was also the period, especially in 1922 and 1923, of the notorious hyperinflation. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. You've probably seen the pictures of people going shopping with wheelbarrows full of banknotes, or using banknotes to light their stove because they're more valuable as paper than as currency. The German currency, the mark, depreciated so much in the inflation that by November 1923, which was the worst part of the inflation, it was trading at 4.3 trillion to the US dollar, if you can imagine. So basically, this currency is worthless. So you might as well use it to start your stove. And when that happens, your economy basically has the floor knocked out of it. And Germany reverted to a kind of crude barter economy where, you would go to the market with a chicken and, buy bread or something. I mean, it's down to that level because money basically has no value. This meant, by the way, that people who had bank accounts got wiped out, which basically meant middle-class people, because it's middle-class people who had their wealth in bank accounts, they got wiped out, which also tended to mean they didn't love the political system that they blamed for having wiped them out of their life savings. So that stored up some trouble for later. However, in the short term, things stabilized. And between 1924 and 1929, there was a period in which things were going better. And the economy improved, the inflation receded. By 1927, all of the main economic indicators were basically back to where they'd been before World War I in terms of employment and GDP and so on. And as that happened, there was considerable stabilization in the political realm as well. Specifically, voters started moving away from the extremes and moving to the center. And the main parties of the Democratic Center got more and more votes. And in the National Reichstag election of 1928, you see that very strongly. The parties of the Democratic Center won. The party getting the most votes was the sort of moderate center-left Social Democratic Party. And it had coalition partners that also came from the Democratic Center. So as of 1928, things kind of look okay. Things look like they're going on an upward path. It actually reminds me a lot of West Germany in the 1950s, where you see that same process happening. And that did go pretty well, and West Germany continued to be a stable democracy. So you can sort of see that future for Weimar in 1928. You can see that that was a possible future at that time. But then various things happened, most notably the Great Depression. And the Great Depression hit Germany actually statistically harder than any other country in the world. Only the United States comes even close in terms of the impact on production and GDP and employment. Just to give you a snapshot of this, in 1932, at the worst point of the Depression, the official unemployment rate in Germany was 40%, like 40. Can you imagine? And historians mostly think that slightly undercounts. So in fact, nearly half of German workers were probably unemployed in 1932. Welfare provisions were rudimentary, and they tended to run out quickly for any individual worker. So what this meant was there was a kind of creeping famine, because about half of German families weren't getting enough to eat on a pretty regular basis. So you've basically got kind of half of your country sort of slowly starving to death. But that's how bad things were in 1932. And as a sort of general proposition, one thing I think I have taken away from many years of studying history is like bad economic conditions create bad politics. Maybe not any specific kind of bad politics, but something bad. Bad economic conditions tend to move people to political extremes. And so that is very much the story of Germany in that time. And then against all this, the thing I mentioned at the outset, above and around all of this, there is this incredible flowering of creativity in Weimar, which just seems to make what comes after seems so much more shocking and surprising. So how is it that we get there? So here's kind of an overview of the pitch I'm going to make to you about why it is actually that it's Hitler and the Nazis that politically succeed out of this environment, which in my view was by no means a foregone conclusion. There are historians out there who will say, oh yeah, it's kind of inevitable that they're going to end up with the Nazis. Actually, one of my favorite historians, brilliant British, now late historian A.J.P. Taylor, who was a funny writer. He's sort of known for his one-liners. One of his one-liners is, it was about as surprising for the German people to end up with Hitler as it is when a river flows into the sea. Well, I think he's actually wrong, but Taylor always said things so well that you sort of say, oh, that's a good line, yeah. But for what it's worth, here's what I think. Fundamentally, if we want to look at why it is that the Nazis got votes, why they were winning elections by 1932, the message they were putting out that was resonating with voters is maybe not what you would expect. It's, in my view, this. They were basically framing themselves as a nationalist protest movement against the economic effects of globalization. And I'll say more about that in a few minutes, but just to sort of give you the big picture here. Secondly, they would never have come to power if they had not been sort of adopted by the conservative establishment that controlled the access to power. And you couldn't get into power without sort of winning over some of the people who were basically gatekeepers of who gets into power and who doesn't. So the Nazis had to be appealing to them, and that was an important part of the story as well. And then third, Hitler's success owed a lot to calculated and massive dishonesty in terms of his messages to the German public. And also a very blatantly irrational appeal, an appeal that wasn't about policy or about any kind of logical thing, but just a kind of gut punch that, if you look at it, meant almost nothing, but sort of would get people going. All right, so let's talk about this a little bit in more detail. So globalization. All right, no one in 1928 or 1932 ever used that word. It wasn't a word in circulation yet. But if you look at what the Nazis actually talked about in campaigns, this is what they were talking about in ways that sometimes look startlingly familiar to us. So why was this an issue? Well, Germany was in many ways a country that was kind of a political football for the rest of the world at that time. And there were many ways in which Germans weren't crazy to feel that they were being victimized by certain kinds of global trends. First of all, and probably most notoriously, there's the peace settlement that ended World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, which, by the way, every year when I'm teaching this with my students, I always say, the Treaty of Versailles was actually not particularly harsh. There's this sort of story that it was like a brutally harsh treaty. It really wasn't, but everybody thinks it was. And then when exam time rolls around, my students say, the Treaty of Versailles was really harsh. I say, by the way, the treaty, not only was the treaty not harsh, but it doesn't really explain how you get Hitler. And they say, the treaty was really harsh and it explains how you get Hitler. So it's like, for people who say professors just brainwash young minds, it's like, my ability to brainwash anybody is like clearly close to zero. So no one needs to worry about that. But anyway, in a more subtle way, though, there is a point here. And so the point is, as I'm sure you all know, Germany was obliged to pay reparations. This is one of the features of the Treaty of Versailles. They were obliged to pay basically billions of dollars in reparations to the main victors of World War I, chiefly Britain, Belgium, and France. The amount that they had to pay varied widely over time. It kept being renegotiated. But anyway, you slice it, it was a large amount. And then from that sort of starting point, there was this incredible kind of like jungle undergrowth of international financial arrangements and agreements and regulations that sort of grew up around facilitating paying the reparations that became this, sort of complicated financial web around Germany, which Germans in the know about finance deeply resented. So give you an example or two. Germany's ability to pay reparations was heavily facilitated by American loans. American banks loaned German governments at all levels massive amounts of money. So you got this weird transatlantic pipeline of money. American banks lend money to German governments pay Belgium and France and Britain. Belgium and France and Britain owed massive amounts of money to the United States from World War I. So they take the reparations money, pay it to the United States. It gets recycled from the United States back into loans to Germany. And so it goes. And it's kind of like musical chairs. It's fine as long as the music keeps playing. The problem with this system is that if for some reason one of those elements in that cycle can't keep paying, then the whole thing's going to break down. And there's a kind of folk belief that with the Great Depression and the financial crash of 1929, American banks now are in trouble and they lose their ability to make loans to Germany. That's true-ish, but actually the problem had started the year before when there was a spectacular boom on Wall Street and American banks started reallocating their resources to the stock market because they could make a lot more money on Wall Street than they could by lending it to the German government. So already at that time, Germany's starting to fall short because they're not getting the loans they need to make reparations payments. However, after 1929, they basically can't. So this financial system breaks down. There were other things. One of the renegotiations between Germany and the Allies to sort of restructure this financial system resulted in the Allies basically taking control of Germany's central bank. So, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve in those days was called the Reich Bank. And it was actually put under legal regulation by the Allies, which stipulated how that bank could manage Germany's currency. It stipulated that the currency be on the gold standard, meaning that basically you can't issue more currency than you have gold reserves, and that was required by the Allies. A bank was created in Switzerland called the Bank of International Settlements in Basel to sort of facilitate all these payments, to facilitate Germany's reparations payments, and to facilitate the loans coming in. That bank is still there, by the way. It has a different function. But that's how it started, as trying to sort of organize this whole financial arrangement. So you put all this together, and the Germans feel like they've just been totally financially strapped down by the Allies, which they kind of had. It wasn't untrue. One guy, a man named Hans Luther, who was both at one time the central banker of Germany and for a while chancellor, he called this an invisible occupation. And again, he wasn't wrong. This was kind of an invisible occupation of Germany through financial means. Caused a lot of resentment. There are many other things. Food imports. Germany had had fairly high tariffs before the 1920s. One thing that the Weimar Republic did was reduce tariffs on food imports, basically because their constituency was working class people who wanted cheaper food, and this made food cheaper. So politically, this made sense. It makes less sense if you're a German farmer, though, because what started happening is German farmers are getting crushed by competition because particularly in the New World, in the United States and Canada and Argentina, there are huge new grain farms opening up, and grain can be produced in much greater volume and much cheaper there than it could on the smaller farms of especially northern and eastern Germany. So you get a kind of financial crisis in the German agricultural sector with farmers going bankrupt and losing their farms and agricultural workers being unemployed. So you get anger starting to grow up in the rural areas associated with tariff issues and international trade flows. So here again, there's anger about what the world economy is doing to Germany. Jobs moving offshore. Now, this sounds really 21st century, right? One of the things that really kind of blew my mind when I was doing this research is that Hitler wrote a book in 1928. I'm sure you've all heard of his famous book, which is Mein Kampf, which he wrote at least partly in prison in 1924. But he wrote another book after that, written in 1928, not published in his lifetime. It came out after World War II. Very imaginatively entitled Hitler's Second Book. I'm not making this up. But one of the, to me, quite mind-blowing passages in Hitler's second book is where he talks about German companies outsourcing jobs to China. I kid you not. This is in 1928. Now, I don't think this was actually happening a lot in 1928, but the fact that he's talking about it is really interesting, which, by the way, underscores another point that I make sometimes. I think to understand Hitler, it is important to understand he was not stupid. No one ever likes to say nice things about Hitler. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not here to say nice things about Hitler. But I think when you're studying history, you have to acknowledge the reality of certain things. And there were things Hitler was good at, or he wouldn't have got where he got. And in some ways, although he had obviously a very weird, quirky, not very well educated mind, he was not stupid, and sometimes he was quite perceptive. And in some ways, he was quite perceptive about these economic issues. And so I think it goes on the sort of perceptive side of things that he sort of saw this as a possibility. And he's got this section in the book, a couple of pages long, where he talks about what's going to happen to Germans when this continues. And he says, Europeans may laugh about it now, but they won't be laughing about it in a few decades when this is really becoming a big deal. So here again, there's this concern with sort of global economic issues, which is fueling a lot of what the Nazis are interested in. And it very definitely fuels their election campaigns. Last point, control of the border. This is an interesting one. Germany had a new border after 1918. That is to say, the new border with Poland, which was a new country on the map after 1918. But Germany did not have the military or police manpower to control that border. And east of that border, there was a lot of turbulence after 1918, notably the revolution and the civil war in Russia, which led to massive refugee flows coming from east to west across Poland and into Germany. Hundreds of thousands of people ended up as refugees in Germany in the 1920s, mostly fleeing the violence in Russia / the Soviet Union. And the Germans just could not control the border. And this became a very, very impassioned issue in the politics of the Weimar Republic. The one party that seemed to have the resolve to try to deal with this was the Nazis. And in fact, in the early 30s, the Nazis started basically lending out their stormtroopers, their paramilitary force, to especially the Prussian state government within Germany to control the border. Because again, Germany didn't have the police or military manpower to do this. So this was another, I think, indicator of some global forces which the Germans feel are hurting them. And it's the Nazis who are successful at positioning themselves as the party that can fight back effectively against them. Now, this is one of my favorite visuals. I use this all the time in my classes. It requires a word or two of explanation. Yes, okay, maybe even 3 or 4 words, I don't know. But let me explain what's going on here. So this graph indicates how the main political parties did over the life of the Weimar Republic in the various elections that were held. So each of these color bands is one of the parties. This is in German, but I'm not sure it much matters. It's going from left at the bottom to right at the top. So for instance, this is the Communist Party, KPD, the Kommunistische Partei Deutschlands. And it sort of goes on up. you actually sort of can't see it here because of this, but down here, these are elections. So 1919, 1920, 1924, on and on into, this is 1928 here, and then 1930, 1932, 1933. So it's over time, and the thickness of the band basically shows you what the vote strength is of that party over time. So there are a couple of really important things that emerge here. Oh, I should mention, by the way, the white bits at bottom and top. In case you're not totally conversant with German, that means non-voters. So as you can see, the non-voting percentage is pretty low. The election turnout was pretty high in Germany in those days. And then there are several important stories that emerge out of this if you consider what it means to look at the thickness of these bands. Now, as I said, these are the main political parties. There were, like, as I said, 30 or 40, but most of them didn't matter. There's this number of parties that sort of were the main vote getters and that did matter. And although the number of them is confusing, it's somewhat simpler if you break it down. I talked about this a little bit in my book that's in your goodie bag. Political scientists and historians sometimes break it down into, to use the jargon, political confessions. Confessions by sort of an analogy to religious history where we talk about confessionalization of a faith group. The idea of a political confession is there are political views that you get kind of socialized into the way you get socialized into a religion too. It's, it's what your family has, maybe your community, maybe your workplace, that sort of influences you in both in terms of how you might come out in terms of a faith group, but also in terms of politics. Political scientists and historians, I think, broadly agree that despite the confusing proliferation of parties, there were actually 3 main political confessions in Germany that were quite stable and consistent over time. So they are the Socialist Working Class Confession, the Catholic Confession, and the Protestant Middle Class Confession. And this chart basically has them. The Socialist Working Class Confession is here. It's basically 2 parties. Forget about this one for now. It's basically 2 parties, the Social Democrats, who are the sort of moderate center-left party, and the Communists, who are the far left. And basically, you would vote for them if you were probably an urban, industrial, or working class person. You would vote for one or the other of those parties. In the middle here, the black band called Zentrum. Zentrum means center in German. And the purple band, BVP. Those are the Catholic parties. It was a sort of weird quirk of German politics, actually fairly common in Europe in those days, that you would have parties that were specifically Catholic, and for the center party, its only mission in German politics was to represent German Catholics in German politics. This reflects a long history of Protestant-Catholic tension in German-speaking Europe. In Germany, the Germany of 1871 to 1945 was, in terms of religious makeup, about 2/3 Protestant, mostly Lutheran, and about 1/3 Catholic. Jews, as we saw in the morning session, were a tiny, tiny percentage, somewhere between 0.5 and 1% of the overall population. So because of their minority status in this Germany, Catholics tended to feel they got shafted by the Protestants. Again, there was some historical justification for this. They did get pretty shafted by the Protestant-dominated state in the 1870s and 1880s in particular. And so they felt they needed a party to represent them, and that's what the center did. The name was also appropriate because the center party did actually occupy the ideological center of the political spectrum. It could sort of form coalitions with almost anybody left or right. So anyway, so that's the Catholic confession here, the working class socialist confession here, and then everything from yellow on up is what we call the Protestant middle class confession. So basically, all of those parties, what they had in common is it was basically Protestants who voted for them, and generally Protestants from the middle classes, as opposed to the working classes who are pretty much down here politically. And so the parties are color-coded. German parties are always color-coded, kind of like our red and blue, except you have more parties, so you have more colors. This is, by the way, still true today. If you follow German politics today, they will sometimes talk about possible coalitions purely in color code terms. So for, in the late 90s and early 2000s, you had a Social Democrat Green coalition, which was simply called Red Green. And sometimes on the German news, they would say, well, Red Green has decided to do X. Or my personal favorite is there's a potential coalition that you could have in Germany. They've had it in one of the states, which they call the Jamaica Coalition. Why, you ask? Because the parties would be the Christian Democrats. That's the party today in Germany, which is basically the descendant of this. And so the Christian Democrats' symbolic color is black. The Greens, whose symbolic color is green. And the Liberals, whose symbolic color is yellow. So that's the colors of the Jamaican flag. So if you get a coalition that's the Christian Democrats, the Liberals, and the Greens, that's the Jamaica Coalition. So Germans will talk about that all the time. So anyway, it's all color-coded. Brown is the color code for the Nazis. So up there at the top, you see NSDAP. That's the abbreviation for the very long actual official name of the Nazi party. Nazi is a nickname. The party was actually the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nationalsozialistische. This is the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or NSDAP. And so you can see what happens to Nazi voting strength over time. And here's where the rubber really hits the road. There is a story that this chart tells about who's voting for whom. Anybody want to take a stab at this? What's the real story in this visual? Yeah, exactly. When the Nazis really start to succeed, and you can kind of see it a little bit in 1928 and then big time in 1930 on to 1933, when it looks like a funnel there, the funnel getting really big. What's actually happening is the Nazis are crushing the Protestant middle class confession. That's the story. I think importantly, they're not getting anywhere here. The Catholic confession pretty much holds up, and the socialist working class confession pretty much holds up. There is some juggling between the communists and the social democrats. The communists are gaining a bit at the social democrats' expense. But basically, those groups hold up. They basically don't vote Nazi. It's the Protestant middle class folks who vote Nazi. And those Protestant middle class parties by 1933, as you can see, have almost disappeared. And the Nazis have completely taken over that space. But that's their space, and that only is their space. Their space isn't the rest of it demographically. And I stress this because it's really important to stress this point to understand, going back to this key question, why are the Nazis succeeding? And part of why they are succeeding is who are they succeeding with? And the answer to that is definitely not everybody. I mean, they are succeeding with a particular demographic segment. And it's important to understand that because it also tells us something about the why. And this is the other part of my argument, that the why has to do with the way they're positioning themselves against the global economy and the effects of the global economy on Germany. They're positioning themselves as a successful nationalist defense against that. And you can see this if you look at what they talked about in their campaigns, if you look at sort of Nazi political rhetoric when they had to fight free elections in the early 30s, and if you look at who's responding to them in terms of where they get votes, then I think that picture snaps pretty clearly into focus, that they start to do well, in particular with people in rural Protestant areas in the north and east of Germany, the people who, as I said, were getting hit by the farm crisis. That's who really starts to flock to the Nazis from about 1928 on. And then gradually they expand out into kind of Protestant middle class circles in cities. But that's always where they're at. They're not getting urban workers to vote for them. They're not getting Catholics to vote for them. They have a definitely rural emphasis to where their vote comes from. They don't do too well in big cities. Big cities tend to be dominated by these guys. Like, for instance, to give you an idea, the Social Democrats and the Communists between them always had a majority in Berlin. So Berlin is not Nazi-friendly territory. Most of the other big cities, Hamburg, Frankfurt, are not Nazi-friendly territory. But the rural north, what today is Schleswig-Holstein, or the sort of Baltic coast area, that is very fertile Nazi territory. All right, so that's one part of the story. Conservative elites are another big part of the story. So as I said, conservative elites had to open the door to the Nazis. This has largely to do with the Constitution, because if you want to be Chancellor of Germany, this is still true, by the way, if you want to be Chancellor of Germany, you have to have the president ask you to be Chancellor and ask you to form a cabinet, form an administration. And so the guy who was president in those days was this fellow, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who had been the supreme commander of the German army in World War I, and then was elected to the presidency in 1925 in a squeaker. He won by like 1%. and then reelected somewhat grudgingly. He didn't want to run, but reelected in 1932. And for his first 5 years or so in office, Hindenburg functioned in a way that kind of surprised democratically minded people who had voted against him, because no one thought this guy was super into the Weimar Constitution. It was pretty clear that what he really wanted was to bring back the monarchy, to bring back the days of the Kaiser and a somewhat more authoritarian state. But for 5 years, he really played by the rules. When the Social Democrats won the election in 1928, he asked the Social Democratic leader to be chancellor, a very constitutionally proper thing to do. But what Hindenburg really wanted is he wanted to move Germany away from a democracy and move it back to a more monarchical and authoritarian system. And events of the early 30s sort of gave him a chance to start doing this. He was not alone. Let's talk about this guy a little bit. Kurt von Schleicher, I write about a lot in my book, one of the most interesting people in this time period. He was a military officer by profession, a general. And in the late 20s and early 30s, he had a kind of interesting job. He had a sort of long job title, but what it actually meant was he was the army's main lobbyist in politics in the capital, Berlin. What he really did was kind of run around and scheme. He would sort of whisper in ears and conspire, always with a view to creating exactly what Hindenburg wanted, to sort of moving Germany away from a democracy, moving it back to a more authoritarian political system. It's a great thing about his name. I mean, this is a guy who, sort of metaphorically sort of crept around hallways and whispered in people's ears. His name, Schleicher, well, let me put it this way. Schleichen in German is a verb meaning to creep or to crawl. So Schleicher would mean a guy who creeps and crawls. And I mean, if you put this in a movie, people would say, "Oh, go on." But it's actually real. I mean, this is what he did. So basically, the real story here is you've got two main groups who have a lot of power in Germany. You've got big business and you've got the military high command. Both of these felt, for different reasons, but both of them felt that the democracy really wasn't working for them. Big business because one thing the Weimar Republic had done was greatly enhance the rights of workers and particularly the rights of labor unions, gave them a much stronger bargaining position. It brought in a nationally mandated wage arbitration system, which basically meant that wages had gone up a lot in real terms over the 1920s, and big business was getting frustrated with having to pay these wages. And there was a generally much more extensive regulatory state, which big business found frustrating. They had gone with it in the early years because business people were worried that the alternative might be something like the Soviet Union. And they weren't thrilled about the Weimar system, but at least no one's actually taking their factory and putting them up against the wall and shooting them or sending them to Siberia. So they kind of go with it for a time. But by 1928, things have stabilized. That fear of getting a communist takeover has receded. And so big business starts kind of feeling its oats and wanting to move away from a democracy and move back to a system that would be more sort of big business friendly. Meanwhile, the army is having very much the same experience because the basically social democrat dominated elected parliament will not vote enough appropriations for military expenditures. And the sort of big thing here comes in 1929 when the military wants a new battleship and the Reichstag votes it down. They won't vote the money for a battleship. And basically the army at that point throws up its hands and says, this democracy won't give us a battleship, the heck with them. Let's try and get to a more authoritarian place so we can get money for defense expenditures. So moving into the 1930s, this is what the elites of the army and big business want to do. They want to find a way to sort of circumvent the democracy and get to a more authoritarian place that will serve their interests. This is really his agenda to make that happen. And they survey the political scene, and it's basically not friendly to them. As we've seen, the Social Democrats and the Communists are the biggest political groups, and they are most definitely not big business or military friendly. But they're starting to be the Nazis. And the thing about the Nazis, well, there's a few things about them, but as far as someone like Schleicher is concerned, or Hindenburg, they are crude. They are, in some ways, a bit dangerously radical. They sometimes say some kind of alarmingly anti-capitalist things. But they're clearly nationalist, they're clearly militarist, and they're really, really clearly anti-communist. And those are all good things for business and the army. So they sort of think we can maybe use them. Maybe the Nazis are what we need in terms of getting an electoral support base behind our agenda. And so basically the story of German politics in the early 1930s, the big story, is these elites, people like Schleicher and who he represents, sort of dancing with Hitler, like each trying to use the other. Hitler needs them to open the door to power. They need him for a support base for their agenda, which they can't get electorally anywhere else. Neither of them likes the other, though, and neither of them trusts the other. Hitler and the Nazis think guys like these, guys like Schleicher are hopeless, elitist reactionaries. And Schleicher and people like him think the Nazis are sort of crude peasants, but maybe useful crude peasants. And so they're sort of dancing around each other. And there's a lot of complexities to this whole story. You can get out of my book. I'll just give you the quick overview here, which is after sort of dancing around each other for a couple of years, they come to a kind of a deal early in 1933, whereby Hindenburg agrees to bring Hitler into power as chancellor. He agrees to have him, whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. That's what I want. He agrees to have him working alongside this guy who becomes Hitler's vice chancellor. Papen is another one of these aristocratic elite gentlemen who very much favors the sort of agenda of both big business and the military. His presence in Hitler's administration is meant to be reassuring to the conservative elites. And so with Hitler as chancellor, Papen as vice chancellor, a cabinet is created on the 30th of January, 1933, which initiates the new regime. Now, there are 11 people in the cabinet when they come into office. Only 3 of them are Nazis, Hitler and then 2 of his colleagues, Hermann Göring, who holds a bunch of different cabinet portfolios and would become Hitler's kind of right-hand man, and someone much less well-known who becomes the interior minister named Wilhelm Frick. Otherwise, 8 other guys are basically non-Nazi, kind of elite, conservative, traditional folks. And everybody figures, well, Hitler's boxed in. He's boxed in by Hindenburg. He's boxed in by the 8 non-Nazi members of his cabinet. This guy utters one of the famous ill-fated quotes in history in which he says to a friend, "We have hired him," meaning we have hired Hitler. And then he goes on to say, "Within 6 weeks, we'll have pushed him so far into a corner, he will squeak." These aristocratic gentlemen were confident that as army officers, he'd been an army officer along with Schleicher, as army officers, as gentlemen, as wealthy men, they can control this rabble. They can control this non-entity Hitler, whose father was a customs inspector. Please. Doesn't speak grammatical German. Hitler didn't. It's not hard to make grammatical mistakes in German, I assure you, but I make them all the time. But then again, I'm not a native speaker. But they really look down on Hitler and his party as a rabble, but a useful rabble. And they think they can control them. And, one of the big stories here is, as we go from 1933 on, is how quickly Hitler proves them wrong and proves his ruthlessness and his cunning in being able to sort of upend them and consolidate power around them and basically eventually squeeze them out of power. But that's a story for another time. Let me just finish by saying a little bit about this, lies and irrationality. There was a lot of talk in those days about the big lie. The big lie in the 1920s and 30s in Germany was the lie about how World War I had ended, which was a story of which the Nazis made very, very effective use. The story here, let me preface this by saying there is zero doubt that Germany was solidly militarily beaten on the Western Front in World War I. They were clearly losing. And their military commanders knew this. The military commanders understood fully well. They're militarily beaten, they're losing in October and November 1918. But no sooner was the war over and the armistice signed in November that those same military commanders, Hindenburg, one of them, and Erich Ludendorff, his deputy, another, they literally start saying 6 months later, at first to a parliamentary committee, no, we were winning. We were winning. And then all these civilian politicians, these democratic politicians, stabbed us in the back. And they made a shameful peace deal with the British and the French and the Americans when we were going to win. It's a stab in the back. It's betrayal. It's treason. So that story started with these military commanders who absolutely knew better. But the people who made effective use of it were the Nazis. They were the ones who were able to sort of mobilize that story most effectively. It sort of fit best with their narrative. So Hitler would always talk about the leaders of the democratic system as being the November criminals. That was one of their sort of sound bites. November criminals because he thought any democratic politician was implicated in the armistice of November 1918, which had been this stab in the back when Germany was actually winning the war, which it really wasn't. But that was the sort of Nazi narrative. And we don't know exactly. I mean, there wasn't really opinion polling in those days, but we think maybe around half of Germans believed that by the early 1930s, that the stab in the back idea was real. The big lie was real. I should just say a word about new media. This was another phenomenon of the 20s and 30s, which I think we sort of forget. One of the things I always say that I doubt anyone actually agrees with, but whatever, is that, for all the talk we have nowadays about social media and how destructive it is for our political and communal life, I think in some ways, like for instance, in spreading disinformation, I don't think it's that big a deal because I don't think you need social media to do that. And for me, exhibit A would be this. There was plenty of disinformation in Germany in the 20s and 30s being spread by things like newspapers, but also being spread by films and radio and phonograph records. A lot of this was very new technology. Radio was new in the 1920s. Phonograph records were basically new in the 1920s. Film was basically new in the 1920s. These were sort of revolutions in communication that could reach people effectively and reach them in ways that more traditional things, like for instance, a politician giving a speech or even a print newspaper couldn't do in quite the same way. They're very effective in spreading kind of irrational, kind of gut punch messages. So one of the examples I mentioned in my book, which I think makes the point effectively, there was a guy named Peter Drucker who became quite famous. Some of you may be familiar with him. He became quite famous in the United States after World War II as a writer on business management. But he was originally Austrian, and then he lived in Germany for a while, and he was a reporter in Germany in the 1930s. And in the course of being a reporter, he once recorded a Nazi giving a speech, and the Nazi politician, and the politician said, we don't want higher bread prices. We don't want lower bread prices. We don't want bread prices to stay the same. We want National Socialist bread prices. Well, yeah, what? I mean, that's exactly correct. I don't know what that means. And that's the point. It doesn't mean anything. But it's sort of like, I don't know, if you're, maybe what you might call a low information voter, you might say, yeah, National Socialist bread prices. Yeah, okay. I mean, it's meaningless, but it's kind of an emotional gut punch. I mean, some of what it might mean, what it might really mean is this. Whatever it is, we decide what it is. We want National Socialist bread prices, meaning we make the law here. Whatever, policy doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be higher or lower, but like we're making it. Maybe that's part of it. But in any case, it's irrational. In any case, it's not like, the way you would like your leaders to be thinking about things, like where actually is, how should we determine a mechanism for bread prices? How should that work? Like, rationally, what goes into that? It's not that. Whatever it is, it's not that. It's a kind of calculated irrationality. This is a lot of the story of the Nazis, the dishonesty and the irrationality, often using new technology in advanced ways. And the Nazis were very tech forward. They made very effective use of radio. They made very effective use of film. Hitler campaigned with an airplane in 1932, which politicians didn't do in those days. But they made a big deal out of this. And Hitler, in some of the 1932 election campaigns, Hitler would fly from town to town. And they used the slogan, Hitler over Germany, as he's flying from town to town. And this made the Nazis look, modern and energetic and tech forward. And that was all an appealing image to a lot of Germans. But again, to Germans in a particular demographic segment, not necessarily to everybody. All right, let me sort of wrap this up here. So here's where I want to say a little bit about maybe the more pedagogical aspects of all this. And things that maybe you might think about in your classes. And again, this is just my take on I think lessons that we might take out of this, but you guys can and will and should have your own takes as well. But here's how it looks to me. I think there are roughly what I've got 4 things that come out of this. Thing number 1 is comparisons are tricky. Given my professional specialty, I am often asked about comparisons from then to now, and I usually give answers that I think people find frustrating. And I say, well, there aren't necessarily a ton, is what my answer usually is, for various reasons. Drawing lessons from history is something that historians usually do badly, weirdly enough. But so does everybody else. I'll tell you my favorite example. Something I learned in my first year of grad school, I think. I read an article by a brilliant Harvard historian named Ernest May. He's sadly passed away, but Ernest May wrote this great piece on how politicians had taken lessons from history in the 20th century and how they had always gotten it wrong. And it goes kind of like this. You have World War I, and then after World War I, there's a story that starts to go around. Historians believe it and circulate it, and politicians in many cases believe it and circulate it. The idea is World War I broke out as a kind of mutual blunder. No one had wanted the war. There hadn't been any aggressive country pushing the war. Everybody had just made a mistake. Leaders had misunderstood each other, and it had been a mistake. I personally think that's wrong, and many historians think it's wrong. I think the war happened because Germany was really pushing it. But be that as it may, this remains controversial. But in any case, the idea grew up that this had been a mutual blunder. The British Prime Minister David Lloyd George famously said, the nations slithered over the brink into the boiling cauldron of war. In other words, no one had wanted it. It had just been a blunder. So with this idea in mind, politicians in the 1930s are thinking about how to prevent the next war. And in particular, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain decides that if the lesson of World War I was that it was a blunder based on bad communication, well, obviously then, to prevent a war, you just go meet the other leader and look them in the eye and talk man to man, which is how Chamberlain would have put it, and shake hands and solve any problems. So with that idea in mind, Chamberlain goes and meets Hitler several times. And this is the famous story of appeasement, trying to make deals with Hitler so that he won't start a war, which didn't work very well because, as it turns out, Hitler really wanted a war. He didn't want to make deals. And you can't really, appease somebody into being peaceful if what they really want is a war. Okay, so then World War II happens. And after World War II, then politicians say, oh, I get it now. The thing is, don't appease an aggressive dictator. Okay, got it. So then you get things like Korea and Vietnam. And the perception in particularly the American administrations of all party stripes is the Soviet Union in specific and communism in general is kind of one totalitarian force bent on aggression, just like Hitler's Germany. So that means you have to stop them in Korea or Vietnam, because if you don't, it'll be like Hitler, not stopping Hitler in the Rhineland or Austria or Czechoslovakia, and then he's in Poland, and then he's in France. We've learned this lesson now. So when the commies are getting aggressive, we'll stop them in Korea so they don't get to Australia, and it's that way of thinking, which again was misplaced. It was a misplaced analogy, as it turns out, onto China and the Soviet Union of the Cold War era. But there's abundant evidence that that was the lesson being applied. John F. Kennedy said once, when they were talking about what to do about Vietnam, in his cabinet, he said, and I'm quoting, all the talk was of Munich, meaning all the talk was of Chamberlain meeting Hitler, and the mistake that was. So, politicians serially got it wrong by trying to take lessons from history. And I think that's a good warning, all of us. So I think you need to be cautious about taking them. That said, I'm going to take a few. So probably wrong, but make of this what you will. I think there are a few lessons that come out of the story we've been talking about here. Lesson number 1 is, if you want to stop an authoritarian attack on democracy, the answer is build a big tent. Build the biggest tent you possibly can. Because in most political contexts that I know of, historically at any rate, the people who would support a non-authoritarian politics outnumber the people who would support an authoritarian politics. So what you need to do is, if you are active in politics, or if you are teaching people you hope will be active in politics, the idea is to build the biggest tent you can, build the biggest coalition around authoritarianism, which means, of course, you're going to have to work with people you may not like, you may not agree with, you may violently disagree on a lot of things. But you probably agree on the most important thing if you're talking about defending a fragile democracy against an authoritarian threat. And as long as you agree on that, I think you should work with people so that the authoritarian thing doesn't happen. And you can stop it that way if you do that. There are historical examples of this happening. Look at Hungary, like a month or so ago, the election in Hungary, an amazingly good outcome from a big tent political strategy. Point number 3. A very brilliant scholar, a political scientist at Harvard named Daniel Ziblatt has written, I think, particularly effectively about this. Historically, it's really interesting. Democracies tend to come into being and survive when conservatives are okay with them, when conservatives conclude that democracy would be okay. And the reason for that is conservatives are important in this equation because historically, and this was certainly true in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, conservatives tend to be the political voice of very powerful groups like big business or the military, who could disrupt democracy if they're not on board with it. So when you get conservatives on board with it, that's when you sort of create a political climate in which a democracy can flourish. I mean, historically, there are examples of this. For instance, in fact, Germany itself, in the 1860s and 70s, it was the very conservative Otto von Bismarck who basically drafted the constitution of the first iteration of Germany in 1871, creating a nationally elected parliament, which was an unintuitive thing, a non-intuitive thing for a conservative to do in those days. But Bismarck thought conservatives like him could play the electoral game better than liberals and could win. And he turned out to be right for a while. And that sort of made the beginnings of German democracy possible. There are similar stories in Britain and France in that era. And as I've just been talking about, it's when conservatives decide they're done with democracy that it's in trouble in Germany in the 1930s. So you need to sort of find ways, if you can, to sort of get conservatives on board with a constitutional democracy where they sometimes may lose. But you have to sort of try and get them to see that it will be in their interest in the long run to be on board with this. And then finally, and I think this is very important for all of us as educators, nothing's ever written, nothing's ever inevitable, and citizen engagement works. And again, I think in very recent politics in a bunch of countries, we've seen examples of how this is true, how citizen engagement can change things and can turn authoritarian threats away. I always, whenever I talk to someone who's active in politics, I know a few Congress people, and they always say, calls to a congressperson's office are actually super important. They take those very seriously. So, I mean, that's always something I encourage my students to do, or anyone I'm talking to do, like, do that. Or, better yet, with whatever time or energy you have, volunteer and get involved in a political campaign, whatever it is you believe. I'm not here to tell you one party or the other or one cause or another, but get involved. Democracy is not a spectator sport, I think. It needs all of us. And it works. I think when you have that, when you have citizen engagement, I think it's impossible to have authoritarianism. Authoritarianism thrives on passive, can't talk anymore. Authoritarianism thrives on a passive citizenry. And then, it's an example of that in Germany in 1933. But I think an active citizenry is one that will not be captured by authoritarianism. All right, I've talked way longer than I actually expected to. Sorry for that. But I am certainly more than, professors are known to do this. I am happy to take any questions or comments that any folks might have. Yes, sir.
You have a question?
Yes, for 1 and number 2, I believe that when you said America 2026 is not Germany in 1933, I believe I see there's some similarities in what we see right now. And also for number 3, I believe that conservative, they are not on board with democracy, what we see right now. So which means that democracy is in danger?
Is democracy in danger in the United States in 2026?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
My answer to that is no, with a footnote. I actually have, I mean, one of the things I feel I've learned from a lot of the work that I do and this kind of research is to sort of enhance my understanding of the fact that Germany in 1933 was a very, 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 very different place from America in 2026. And I think most of those differences point to what I think is the conclusion that America is not ever going to be anything but a democracy. I really do believe that. I don't think we are the stuff of which authoritarianism is made. I think for all kinds of cultural reasons, for some structural reasons, this is a big, complicated country with a lot of different jurisdictions and a lot of different power centers. And with, I think, a deeply, deeply individualistic ethos. I mean, there's social science research on this. Americans are the most individualistic people in the world by all kinds of measures. And it's very hard to make an authoritarian system out of people who sort of say, no, man, I'm doing my own thing. Germans are kind of not like that. And there's some good sides to that and some less good sides. I mean, still today, Germans are a lot more sort of conformist and deferential to authority than Americans. This means they tend to be a lot more sort of community conscious, and they show a lot more signs of solidarity with their fellow citizens than we do. And sometimes I wish we could emulate that a little bit. But the silver lining in that cloud is that we do our own thing no matter what. And, so I am kind of long-term optimistic about, this country politically. I guess that's what I would say. Yes, ma'am.
This is an opinion question, but I'm really fascinated to know your no, it's not.
No.
Oh, okay. Not political. So I taught AP Lit. My students read Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451.
Oh, yeah. Great book.
And I asked them this question, and I want to know your answer to it too. When it comes to government collapse or genocide or something very inherently wrong with society. So the society is already there, right? Like it's already dystopian. Going back to the beginning, when it starts to unravel, what do you think is the single most important indicator? For example, censorship, propaganda. Like, what do you think is the single biggest indicator that a society is starting to lose its way? And again, it's an opinion question. So
Yeah.
I'm interested to know.
I think that's an excellent question. In all the talks like this I've done, I've never actually had that question before. It's a really good one. So I'm going to spitball an answer to you. This is just sort of off the top of my head. I don't think it's censorship. I think it's probably, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this.
The appreciation for education. So education wasn't prioritized. Stephen said cell phones, which I stand on that.
By the way, on the education point, one thing I learned from a student that I was happy to learn, I had a student some years ago who wrote a paper on the German occupation of Poland. And one of the things the Germans did is they decreed that Polish children should not learn literature or history in school, precisely because that breeds independent thinking and not kowtowing to an authoritarian system. And I thought, that's awesome. So I mean, what all of us do in this room, right, is the most non-authoritarian thing you can possibly do, teaching young people history and literature. Great. I'm so happy the Nazis didn't want me to do that. But to answer your question, I think my answer would be systematic state-led violence. It's the thing I worry about the most, and it's the thing that I think is the biggest danger signal.
You just started to answer my question. I was going to ask about if you see a correlation with the levels and intensity of violence and the types of violence as it relates to the demise of democracy.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, actually, because I think it's important. Actually, I've written a couple things on this recently. Let me see if I can remember the numbers. So sometimes when people ask me specifically about parallels between this and now in America, I say the numbers matter. So for instance, one of the major ways in which the Nazis rounded up enemies and in many ways attacked and killed enemies when they were consolidating power in 1933 was via their stormtroopers, an organization that goes by a bunch of names. They were officially the Sturmabteilung, or SA, also known as stormtroopers, also known as brown shirts. Same thing, same organization. There were in 1933, 3 million of them, and fairly quickly it got so there were 4 million in a country of 65 million people, all right? So if you sort of run the math on this to make a comparison to America now, we would need to have somewhere in the ballpark of 20 million stormtroopers to be getting the equivalent level of state-driven violence and repression that the Germans experienced in 1933. To put this in some context, because some people have suggested a parallel between the stormtroopers and ICE, there are about 20,000 ICE agents. Okay, it ain't this. I'm sorry, it ain't the same thing. I mean, it's just really not the same thing. And I would go so far as to say, it is somewhat. This may sound harsh, but I feel it is somewhat disrespectful to the experience that people had in Germany in the early 30s to suggest that we're having the same thing, because it's not the same thing. The scale of it was vastly different in Germany at that time. I don't mean that you're being disrespectful, but I mean like to sort of say, oh, there's just an exact parallel. Yeah, yeah.
Not today, just from 1918 to maybe the 1940.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. So violence evolved in sort of odd ways in the Nazi regime. I mean, in the early period, it was sort of literally out on the streets. And anywhere you were going about your business in Germany in 1933, you would probably see stormtroopers beating somebody up. That fairly quickly came to an end in basically 1934, and then the violence kind of went indoors, so to speak, and to some degree outside of Germany. So of course, famously, the Holocaust mostly happened outside of Germany, mostly happened in Poland and the Soviet Union, and even the concentration camps in Germany were, sort of semi-secret environments where the violence was sort of moved there. So you wouldn't see much of it as an ordinary citizen.
Hi, a question about number 4. I'm just curious about nothing in politics is ever inevitable, and how we were talking earlier about the sort of the stand by, right? The passivity that could lead to something like the Holocaust. I know you were also mentioning kind of the creativity of Germany prior to the Nazis and everything progressive in that society that existed before that. Can you talk a little bit about what that civic engagement might have looked like in Germany, like what the sort of how they went down fighting against the Nazis, or sort of what that individual level looked like?
Well, so they basically didn't go down fighting against the Nazis. That's part of the problem. There was widespread acceptance of what the Nazis were doing. And in fact, there was, in early 1933, there was fairly widespread enthusiasm for some of what they were doing. There was a feeling, there was a kind of bandwagon effect, especially in March and April of 1933, after Hitler had pretty much consolidated power. And there was a widespread feeling in Germany that, well, the democracy wasn't working. We had this horrible depression and sort of political conflict. This government is energetic, and it's going to, it's setting out to solve problems, and they're doing it in an energetic way. So maybe let's give that a shot. Maybe that's going to work. There was also the fact that Hitler came to power legally. I mean, he came to power through the methods that the Constitution said someone should come to power. He led the party that got the most votes, and the president asked him to be chancellor. Totally constitutionally proper. So that made it difficult for especially the social democrats who had basically drafted the Constitution and were famously law-abiding folks. It made it very difficult for them to oppose that, because you couldn't say there's anything illegal about this. And to oppose it, you would have to do something illegal, like an uprising or a coup or something, against people who had come to power legally. And the Social Democrats couldn't quite stomach doing that, and their supporters couldn't quite stomach doing that. So there was, and then the other group that might have, risen up and caused trouble was the communists. But in those days, all communist parties took their orders from Moscow, and Stalin thought it was actually good that the Nazis had come to power. So he told the communists not to oppose them. He changed his mind a year later when it was too late, by which time all German communists were either dead or in concentration camps. But so all the sort of possible means by which there might have been pushback and opposition, and possibly effective pushback and opposition to the Nazis, were hobbled by the various conditions. Oh, and the fact that unemployment was so high. So in 1920, a general strike had stopped a right-wing coup, stopped it cold. But a general strike was going to be of no use when you have 40% unemployment. So that was another tool that couldn't work in 33. So there was somewhere between widespread apathy and acceptance and even enthusiasm for the Nazis when they first came in.
I've got a specific historical question,
Sure.
and that is Article 48.
Yeah.
Was it unique as far as other countries? Was it something new that hadn't been put in a constitution before? And then without that sitting there, do you think Hitler's influence and popularity with the brokers of power would have meant even without it, he eventually would have been able to take full control the way he did?
Both good questions. There were analogies to Article 48, as far as I know, in the laws of most countries. It's a fairly well-established principle that you need some kind of emergency power, at least potentially in the hands of your executive branch for when there's an emergency. Okay, the one I know best, having gone to law school in Canada, is Canada had something called the War Powers Act, which sort of did some of what Article 48 did. Not constitutional, strictly speaking, but a sort of legislative tool to make that happen. Of course, America has something somewhat similar, has an emergency powers law. So France had something quite similar. So there were analogies to this in various countries. The second branch of your question, I'm sorry, could you rephrase the second branch of your question? Or just repeat for me? Yeah.
Due to the support he had with broker power, he still would have just eventually, it would have been essentially without Article 48, they might have just taken him a little longer.
So that's a great question. Without Article 48, the politics of the early 30s would have looked profoundly different, because Article 48 really structured the politics of the early 30s. Because what was happening is, in a way, this goes back to what I said about you can really, if you want, you can really quibble about the dates of the Weimar Republic. And some historians say it ends in 1930, not 33, because from 1930 on, the people who were named chancellor didn't govern through the Reichstag. They governed using executive orders under Article 48. And the sort of game being played here, I mean, this happened initially in 1930 when a chancellor named Brüning came in, and he passed basically sort of economic crackdown measures to reduce welfare payments. He did that as executive orders. The Reichstag voted them down because they were too harsh on ordinary people. He called an election, or the president technically called an election, which they could do, and they had an election, and that's when the Nazis first had a big breakthrough. So after that, the Social Democrats, who were still the biggest party in the Reichstag, concluded, we'd better not vote against these executive orders because they're bad, but if we keep voting them down, Hitler will come in and that's worse. So there's this sort of awareness that at any time, a president or a chancellor could do something by executive order. If the Reichstag pushes back against it, the president can call an election and dissolve the Reichstag. While the election campaign is going on, you can do whatever you want under executive orders. And then when the newly elected parliament comes back, they may push back against the order or not. But this is part of the dance of the early 30s, like sort of navigating this tug of war between the chancellor and the president using Article 48 and the Reichstag that could or could not vote against them. But how that's going to work at a time when Germany was basically being ruled for 3 years before Hitler via Article 48 and via executive orders under Article 48. So without that whole structuring mechanism, the whole political contest would have looked really different. So then I think we're into like pretty squarely alternative history. So we'd have to think about how your question plays out. The Nazis would still be getting the electoral support that they got. How much that would still make them appealing to somebody like Schleicher or Hindenburg would sort of depend how they think about other elements of the Constitution, I think. So that would be, it's an interesting question, which I think would require more thought than I can give it in the next 2 minutes. But it's a great question.
Yeah, I have a question for you about number one. Fully respecting the fact that if there are problems in America, they will follow an American pattern, not a German pattern. Democracy doesn't really require a respect for electoral minority rights, especially in this day and age, political rights. Like right now, we're in a situation where political majorities feel like they can redistrict to silence minority political voices. And, that looks a lot in some cases like also being targeted against racial minorities. So what would be the response to um, a majoritarian democratic lack of respect for minority participation as well as rights that would sort of parallel this history maybe a little bit more?
Well, I don't know if it would parallel this history, but I think the response to that would have to look something like the civil rights movement in the South in the 40s and 50s and 60s, because that's where you have that kind of situation. You have, I mean, famously the old South was like a bunch of one-party states, basically with the Democrats solidly in control and with African Americans largely disenfranchised. And so a movement to overturn that had to use other than electoral channels. They had to use other means, like the bus boycott in Alabama, for instance, or, whatever. So, I mean, something like that, some kind of organized campaign that can move at other things than an electoral level would be the way you eventually get around that, I think. Not that it's probably easy, but it can be done. I think that's what it would have to look like.
To go with all of that, what you just mentioned about a non-political movement and number 4 with citizen engagement works, what was the role of civil disobedience in all of this?
They're Germans. There was no rule. I mean, Germany is the country where, as a New Yorker jaywalking all over the place, I get told by 5-year-old kids that I shouldn't be jaywalking. Yeah, I am, clearly. The only rule that they will systematically not respect is a no smoking sign. I have plenty of personal experience with this as well. Germans will light up anywhere and everywhere. I've learned that the way that will provoke a sort of rude street level German that I didn't know I possess was when someone's smoking right in front of me under a no smoking sign. And then suddenly this like really rude street German will come out. I don't know where it comes from. But anyway, to answer your question seriously, but actually that is kind of the answer. There was close to no civil disobedience. Again, for some of the reasons that we were talking about a second ago. At least initially. I mean, there certainly was resistance later on, not necessarily resistance in the form of civil disobedience the way we might think of that in an American context. I mean, to engage in resistance in a totalitarian state that has, complete control of the media and complete control of the police, you can't do anything openly, or if you do, that's suicide. And even doing it covertly is pretty close to suicide. I mean, one of the depressing things about the German resistance to Hitler is that there were a lot of really brave and noble people who almost all ended up dead. Famously, the people of the Valkyrie plot in 1944 who tried to kill Hitler, and they had basically tried to kill Hitler, I don't know, a half dozen times before that, which is less well known, starting in 1938, by the way. So when people say, oh, they're just a bunch of Nazis who were mad they were losing the war. Well, their thing started in 1938 before there was a war. So no, they weren't just a bunch of bad Nazis who were mad they were losing the war. But they all basically ended up dead. Or, a good pedagogical thing, kind of like with Anna Frank, for when you're talking with younger people, to talk about the students of the White Rose movement who thought they could overturn the Nazis by passing out leaflets among their fellow students saying the Nazis are bad. And they found that didn't actually spark a revolution, but they did get turned in by a janitor and then speedily executed. So, the story of resistance tends to be this kind of story over and over again of sort of, again, well-meaning and noble people who are just up against something that's too big for them. And ultimately, the only way you can bring down a state like Hitler's regime, I mean, you have to have the army or the police do it. Those are the only people who can do that when it's a state like that. And, the army did sort of try. They just turned out to be very bad at coup d'etats. But, I think that's kind of that story.
One more question. As long as you're good on time. Sure.
I'm good.
Yeah, we'll see. After the next question, we'll take some questions online.
Why do you think Stalin wants the Nazi to be in power?
I'm sorry, why?
Why do you think Stalin wants the Nazi to be in power?
Okay. Well, the reason for that is Stalin had a theory that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union put out in 1928, in which they said capitalism was in its third period. And as a hockey fan, I love this. But there's a couple chuckles there. Down here, maybe y'all aren't hockey fans. I don't know. The idea of capitalism being in its third period, what Stalin thought that meant was that capitalism had gotten to a place where it's about to collapse. The workers are about to overthrow it and create, a communist utopia. So when this happens, capitalists panic and they turn to the only people who are tough enough to stop that, which is fascists. And so for Stalin, fascists coming to power is good because it means the revolution is just around the corner. So Stalin thought that Hitler coming to power was actually good because once you've got fascists in power, then you're going to get a communist revolution very soon after, and then Germany will go communist, and that'll be great. The other thing, by the way, that Stalin did, which was unhelpful, was that he ordered the German communists not to join any coalition with the Social Democrats. And for most of the Weimar Republic, that coalition would have been a majority. So that coalition could have stopped the Nazis cold. But Stalin said, no, you can't work with the Social Democrats. Part of this whole third period thing was Stalin said the Social Democrats are social fascists. They're no different than the Nazis. Wrong. But again, the fact that he ordered the communists not to engage in coalitions basically meant that Germany was doomed. Stalin rethought this in 1934, too late for Germany. But the fact that a couple of years later in 1936, a coalition came into power in France called the Popular Front, which was the kind of big tent I've been talking about. The Popular Front was a coalition between the communists and the socialists and a sort of conservative centrist party. Basically anybody who wasn't fascist in the French political spectrum, which kept the fascists out of France. Fascists never came to power in France until the Germans beat them and sort of brought in a fascist movement. But that big tent kept the fascists out at a time when France might have voted for a fascist party in the 1930s. So Stalin got to this point, but he got to it too late for Germany, and it was basically this idea about fascists coming to power being good news for communists that led him to think that the Nazis coming to power was good news.
Let's see if anybody else online has it. Does anyone online have a question? This is your opportunity. So there's a lot of people ask the question, or at least have had students ask the question because it comes up. You got Stalin being communist, and you have Hitler being and saying fascist. But some people say, knowing the difference, because a lot of times it gets kind of woven together.
I hate all of these terms, frankly. I dislike the term fascist, basically because it doesn't mean anything. The scholars have been busting their guts for a century trying to come up with a definition, and no one has the same definition, and everyone has their own definition, and who knows what it means. Who knows what regime counts as fascist or not? There's basically no consensus on that. Who knows what the hallmarks of fascism are? I think for my money, the smartest definition from a scholar who has sort of tried to do this, there's a great historian named Robert Paxton who wrote a terrific book 20 years ago or so called The Anatomy of Fascism, which I highly recommend. And Professor Paxton comes up with a definition of fascism, which I think is probably roughly right, but it's a page long. I mean, it's like this tells you the problem here. So I actually sort of hate using the word fascism. And your question also raises the problem too of often these words are used in very bad faith. Like basically everybody gets called a fascist. And so sometimes, the answer to what does fascism mean is it's whatever politician you don't like. Like years ago, George W. Bush was called a fascist, and then Obama was called a fascist, and then Biden was called a fascist, and then Trump's called a fascist. I mean, everyone, if you don't like the president, you call him a fascist. And that sort of underscores the meaninglessness of the whole thing. The other slightly confusing thing, my students sometimes wrestle with this a little bit, I bet yours maybe do too, which is that Hitler's party is called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, right? If you took the national off, if you just had like the Socialist German Workers' Party, you could probably safely conclude this is a left-wing Marxist party, probably. That sounds like a left-wing party name. And some people do say that. They say, well, the Nazis were really on the left. And that's squarely wrong. It's just squarely wrong. Many people who say that, I think, do in bad faith, in an effort to try and sort of paint the left as actually being fascist. Hitler's coalition partners when he came into power were the conservative authoritarian right. The first people to get sent to concentration camps were communists and social democrats. the Nazis were perceived by everybody in their time as being on the right. That's why Hindenburg wanted Hitler in office. I mean, they were a party of the right. There's a little grain of complexity here in the sense that they were a party of the right that sometimes said kind of anti-capitalist things. And in fact, there were differences of opinion among Nazis. Historians sometimes speak confusingly a little bit of left-wing and right-wing Nazis. And the left-wing Nazis were the people who talked more about anti-capitalism, sometimes even sincerely. But the thing is, they all got killed by Hitler pretty soon on. I'm sure you've probably heard of the Night of the Long Knives, which was one of the big sort of bloodbaths of the early period of Hitler's rule. And basically what was happening in the Night of the Long Knives, which was June 1934, is a number of people who could be classified as left-wing Nazis, more sort of anti-capitalist, egalitarian Nazis, were murdered by Hitler because he was finding them inconvenient, because he wanted to steer in a more consistently right-wing direction. So the name of the party and some of their rhetoric causes a bit of confusion, but the Nazis were squarely on the right, which is why they put socialists and communists into concentration camps.
That was actually, because that comes up a lot and people don't usually say it, and having that kind of clarification is really interesting to say it's not even clear, because I think a lot of people say it and use the term and it comes up in conversations a lot, at least and it came up in my classrooms years ago, and I still think it comes up today. And I think this comes back to what, Logan and talk about definitions and words matter. Yep. And how we use them, especially when we're teaching. And a lot of us say things with a lot of good intent without defining the terms or saying, you know what, it's more complicated than that, or using that one-page definition that seems inconvenient, but also it's more than that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone else have any other questions? I didn't see any more pop in online. Dr. Hett?
Well,
close out?
Let me just say, well, first of all, again, thank you. Thank you very much for your courteous attention and for your great questions and comments. If anyone would like to follow up with me, if you have any other questions or comments, or if you want reading recommendations or anything, please feel free to email me. My email, I think, is pretty readily accessible on the Hunter College History Department website, or I have a personal website, which you can reach me through also. If I can be of any assistance to you on stuff, please let me know. Otherwise, thank you very much. And let me also just say, by the way, that I love the fact that you're here. Seeing you, give up a chunk of your summer to be dedicated to this work just makes an old teacher's heart happy. So good for you. Thank you very much, and good luck with everything you're doing this week. Thank you.
Well, I was going to have Logan come back up, but actually we're kind of coming late. We didn't give you a stand-up break, so we're not going to give you a stand-up break. I'm just going to let you leave a little bit early and wrap up. But tomorrow you got Logan all day long. Again, that's not a threat. This is a good thing. It's like, yay! This is hopefully, if anybody's had any problems, especially online, following through with the discussion threads, where everything is. Again, right now all you've got is some surveys. The pieces of the slides with the information or whatnot, that's just for you to review. That is not, there's no quiz or assignment going with it. It is just extra information. So if you think it's overwhelming, it's just meant for you to review at your own leisure. So if you have any questions on it or anything like that, let me know. The rest of the week, real quick, I want to finish up with tomorrow is Logan will be speaking. We've got a lot of different great topics that are engaging tomorrow. Wednesday, for those of you that were here a couple of years ago, who was here when we did the virtual tour of Auschwitz before? But it was not a virtual tour of Auschwitz technically. It was a walkthrough of, that was kind of done like an eye walk, but done what we're doing on Wednesday is actually being led by a live tour guide who's going through both camps. This is not so everyone who's online, if you were within driving distance, I would come here because I'm not promising how great the connection will be when I'm connecting to a Zoom for this. We're going to have a couple of different codes to try to help you log in, but I guarantee you it will be more impactful if you are here. It is a very intense presentation. They are walking you through. They're walking through both camps, through Auschwitz and Birkenau. So it is a 3-hour kind of like presentation. They're walking, they're narrating, they're telling you stories. They're also overlaying with some testimony as well throughout the walk. But it is not for it'll be challenging, and I'll remind you again. Jasmine is going to do a presentation after that, and then we're going to have Survivor Alan. Very loud. Oh, he's going to be coming up from Miami. I'll pick him up on Tuesday. On our last day, we have a survivor from the Bosnian genocide, Dr. Amra Savaka-Reyes, she has an amazing story, but she talks about addressing perpetrator style behavior that happens and how do we teach this type of difficult history in early grades and ages. She's an amazing presenter. We had her here once, and I think we had 10 people show up, and I said, I need to bring her back. She has an amazing book. She has an amazing story. And then we'll kind of wrap up in the afternoon where you'll get to see our new museum design. We're actually going to have you inform on some of the pedagogy and practices of our walkthrough, of basically our museum activities. We'd like to get input from those of you that are here. The museum design team will be here. I've got labeled one, but we have two of the design team will be here, and they specialize not in Holocaust history. They specialize in immersive storytelling. Which is, it's how to engage and how do we want to engage students. So I think we've got a really nice filled out week for you. I hope today met your expectations, and that if you have any problems, feel free to reach out by email. I will be asleep in 1 hour. So I hope you have a great rest of your night, and I'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning bright and early. Thanks.
Online that came
Hold
from
on.